Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about architectural theory and cookbooks. I'm joined today by the multidisciplinary artist Esther Choi. I've been following Esther's work for a long time now, but primarily knew her only as an architectural historian and writer. She has a PhD in architectural history and theory from Princeton and studied the history and theory of architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and has written for all sorts of architecture and design publications. But what you'll quickly find is this is just one small part of her work. She's also a trained photographer and recently published Le Corbuffet, a Fluxus-inspired artist book of text and images that adopts the form of a cookbook. And last year, during the pandemic, she started something called Office Hours, which is a socially engaged project focused on the sharing of knowledge amongst practitioners who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. As you'll see, Esther's work is both deep and far-reaching, and I was excited to talk to her about all of this. We talk about how she defines her work and the threads that tie these different projects together. We talk about being in academia and how this influenced her art practice. And then we talk about how writing, reading, and theory changed the way she thought about the forms her work could and does take. There's so much in this one. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Remember that if you like the show, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans that give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive interviews, all while helping to financially support the show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to help support the show. Thank you as always for listening, and here is my conversation with Esther Choi. I actually want to start very basic, and I'm curious how you describe what you do or what you say that you do. Back in the before times, if you were at a party and someone asked what you do, how do you describe what you do?
Good question. Now I say I'm an artist. I work across the fields of art and architecture, and I'm also trained as an architectural historian. So depending on my mood and my employment, I wear different hats. But yeah, for a long time, that was a really difficult question for me to answer because I felt I really had to striate sort of my interests and my training.
Mm-hmm.
But I think after studying all these 19th century people, I decided I'm just going to be 19th century in the 21st century and just have
I
a
love
lot
it.
of different, commas beside my occupation. And I think, the people that genuinely interest me most are the people that have a lot of commas
Mm-hmm.
beside their occupation. Like I always look to Adrienne Piper.
Mm-hmm.
She's like a philosopher and also a conceptual artist and also,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that those kinds of composite identities are always, they seem a little more honest to me if I'm honest, but maybe I don't know. Maybe it's just also it's taken me a while to accept that because there is an enormous pressure professionally and
Yeah.
socially to just say you're one thing. So I wish I was a poultry scientist or something, but I'm not. Like I'm not one thing. And for immigration purposes, for my visa, it definitely can make it complicated. It'd be much easier to say I was a poultry scientist. But anyways, I digress already.
That's exactly why I was asking, because that I am also interested in those people, and I think this show is kind of about those people who have a lot of commas, and I think I've always strived to be one of those people that has a lot of commas. And the reason that I asked that for you and kind of like how you define yourself is because I first came to your work through your writing and kind of historical work, and then only later discovered this background that you have in photography and and this whole kind of other side. And it seems like to me, as somebody kind of from the outside who's followed your work in the last few years, that background seems to have become more integrated into the side of you that I was aware of, if
Hmm.
that makes sense. And so maybe to like pick that apart for a second, could you talk a little bit about that background? You originally studied photography. You have a BFA and MFA in photography. Is that right?
I do indeed.
Can you talk about that and then where kind of architecture started to fit into that for you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I did not study architecture and practice. I have no professional degrees. I came to architecture through my art practice, and I was doing my MFA and basically working architecturally, making drawings of installations I wanted to have built, and I would, hire contractors to build these installations. I think produced two photographs in a span of like 3 years.
That's
I mean,
awesome. Yeah.
they were painstaking photographs that were enormous, but they were, I was working a lot with video and installation and
Mm,
writing a lot of theory and making models. And it was my advisor who was like, hello, you're basically working architecturally. You're looking at artists that make work about architecture.
mhm.
You're in the Canadian Center for Architecture's library all the time because I studied in Montreal. Like it's kind of a no-brainer. Maybe you should think about think more about architecture. And it just was a profession that was just never, it literally never entered my mind. I went to an arts high school. I mean, it was all, I was a visual arts major.
Yeah, yeah.
I was doing like lithography, and for some reason it like it never occurred to me to study architecture. I didn't have also anyone in my family who, I mean, I was the first person to go to college in my immediate family, and like,
Mm,
most of my family didn't, to be a creative when you come from a like a lower income background is like pretty unheard of. So like there was no one that ever exposed me to architecture. So it was like so weird to be the age of like 25 or 26 and have someone say like hello. So anyways, I ended up, as I was working on my final thesis MFA project, which was this like kind of elaborate installation I had built with this contractor and all architectural. It was like super. It was really funny. It's kind of basically about architectural theory in a lot of ways,
mm.
and ways of inhabiting drawing, and like a very architectural spatial problem. And uh, I ended up applying to Harvard's Graduate School of Design to do a Master of Design Studies in History and Theory because my whole MO was to learn more about architecture as a subject, not as a practice.
Right, right.
Um, and I didn't think I would get in. I just kind of, I just put in the
Yeah.
application and I just went about my business of finishing my thesis. And then basically, like, I think it was the day before my defense of my MFA, I found out I got in, which, was like shocking. Anyways, that was like then. So then I thought I was at the GSD thinking that I was like an artist, like I'm just here because I don't
Okay.
want to be a tourist. I don't want to like
Yeah,
make,
yeah.
I just, that was like a big criticism that I had of a lot of artists when, you look at the kind of rigor of their ideas and the work when it's about architecture or using architecture as a kind of alibi for other things, that it seemed a little surface sometimes.
Mhm, mhm.
And I didn't want to be that person. So, trying to avoid imposter syndrome, I decided to do like another master's degree. And then, um, but I think like it felt, you just like, I just realized I was like, I was just dipping my toe into a much larger set of issues and a discipline and a field. And so I ended up teaching in art for a very long time after that. But concurrent to teaching, I was editing books of architectural theory and getting more and more interested in the kind of history of ideas around architecture. And then that led to a PhD. So all of it was like the reason why I think it's really astute observation that it's like, oh, she seems like she's a historian. She's writing all the time. And then suddenly, what? She's an artist? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And it's because I think when you're doing a PhD, I mean, we were next door. I was in the Department of Architectural History and Theory at Princeton, and it was an incredible program, an incredible opportunity to have like an education at that caliber. That was just like it's just like unheard of for me. Coming from also like my socioeconomic status before. Like no one in my family has ever had like opportunities like this. So it was like I could not say no to that when I found out that I was accepted into that program. But it definitely was like a serious question I had to ask, which is like, well, when I finished my MFA, I had an art gallery at a dealer. I was on a track to be a professional artist. And do I really want to compromise that by spending 8 years writing a PhD. Like it's impossible to have concurrent careers when you're doing doctorate work or doctoral work because it's like a full-time job, and I felt enormous pressure in the academy to like not be an artist. Like, what? You can't be an artist. Artists are like, they're not rigorous, they're anti-intellectual. There was all these like
Yeah, yeah,
assumptions
yeah,
made.
yeah,
Even the art history department, like you go in there next
yeah.
door, and I took a lot of classes in art history, and it was a phenomenal department. But like very few people actually even had studied art as a practice before starting art history. So it was like super weird that I was in architectural history and an artist and came with this weird background that was incredibly practical in some ways and technical. So, like at lunchtime, I would literally sitting with photo historians, like explaining how photographs were constructed when they would show me negatives from archives. Like it was like,
Right.
it's just like a weird, but I never really knew what to do with that. And so I kind of like toggled back and forth and thought maybe I'm just not meant to be an artist, like maybe it's just more
Mm,
practical to be. And I just felt a lot of social pressure. And anyways, this is a very long answer to your question, but basically, after finishing my PhD, and it was like basically at the tail end of finishing my PhD, I just couldn't help myself by like making work.
right,
And
right.
it ended up being this really weird book that I made that was, I mean, it's maybe not that weird, but it was an artist book, weird for me, an artist book that took the form of a cookbook of all things. And it was
Yeah.
like basically the result of me, I think, like trying to repress like a lot of my actual interests. And it just, I couldn't help it. And it just kind of came out. And like, then I just was like, the jig is up.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it, you know
Right.
what I mean?
I
Like
get it. Yeah.
I love taking pictures. Like I love image making. I love art. Like all of my books are about art. Like I can't not be that person. And so I was like, I think instead of thinking so much about social pressures and a bio line, maybe I can just be who I am
Right. I
and do the
love that.
things that interest me and fulfill me and that can sustain me like creatively and make me happy, because at the end of the day, we don't know how long we're on this earth. And like, you know what I mean? Like I'm not going to
Yeah.
be on my deathbed being like, I'm so glad that my paper was accepted into a scholarly journal. I'm going to be like, I'm so glad that I lived a life where I felt really happy to get up in the morning and the things that I make bring me pleasure. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyways, that's, sorry, it's a complicated answer for me because it's been like, I think my professional identity, I worked so hard to like towards sort of like my passions, but it's like I also realize sometimes those things don't fit with social structures or
Yeah.
systems that where you can monetize it or you can,
Yeah. Yeah.
gain recognition for it. And I think even still, like the work that I do as an artist is, it's difficult for it to be commercial. Like all of these things are things that I have to kind of think about a lot and also then at some point let go of, because at the end of the day, we're not like machines to produce commodities. We're human
Yeah.
beings. So
I
anyways, sorry, it's a long
no.
answer to your
No,
question.
I totally get that. And I actually feel like that question set up everything else that I wanted to talk to you about.
Okay,
Like
great.
every question I had was embedded in that answer. I want to the art book you were talking about was Le Corbuffet, which I do want to come back
Yeah.
to and talk about a little bit more. But you said something very early about when you were studying photography and you had this advisor who said, "Have you ever considered architecture?" And you said something about how you were writing a lot of theory at the
Yeah.
time. Also, where did that was that part of the program? Were you always interested in writing? Where did that kind of theoretical side come in for you?
The program is, so I did my MFA at Concordia. I would say of MFA, it's, so Concordia is like, one of the oldest MFA programs in Canada. It's been around forever. It is longer than other MFA programs. And at least when I was there, it was highly theoretical. I mean,
Mm.
I was taking classes on Deleuze and Spinoza and
Oh
Bergson
wow.
with, Brian Masumi, who translated A Thousand Plateaus. Like it was
Right. Yeah.
like those classes, like I would leave. I had never studied philosophy in my undergrad, and like
Mhm.
I would leave, my head would be throbbing, and we would literally spend like 3 hours on like 2 pages of text and just like really deeply analyzing it and discussing it. And I had just
Mhm.
never engaged with that kind of slow, deep reading before. And so, anyways, this is to say, it was like, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways you could navigate that program, but I was always really gravitating towards more theoretical classes.
Okay.
And in a way, I also suffered a lot when I was earlier in my career, I guess, from writing about the things that I want to make and not making them, right?
Yes, yes, I have been
Because I
there. I
felt,
might still be
yeah,
there, honestly.
yeah, it's hard because, you don't have resources,
Mhm.
and, you kind of get in grant writing mode of like
Yeah.
this hypothetical thing. And then that weirdly satisfies this like weird part
Mhm.
of your ego where you think that you've made some grandeur, but really none of it exists. And so that,
Mhm.
yeah, that was a problem for me. And also thinking a lot about the difference between the intention of your work versus the effects of your work. Like I was really wrapped up in intentionality and not like actually what I was making. Like,
Mm.
so anyways, so yeah, so I was writing a lot, but it really was a way for me to fulfill some problems of making, and not because but I was always like, I've always been like very interested in, I guess, like ideas around work. So like
Yeah,
artist
yeah.
writing, theoretical writing about art, like that to me is something I've always gravitated to. So, anyways, I think I was like trying to, I don't know what I was trying to do, but um, that's sort of where it started.
Yeah, I feel like I'm the exact same way. I know exactly what you're talking about. And it was the same way when I was in an MFA program taking philosophy classes. I just like loved it. And I had never done that before either. My undergrad had none of that. I had never heard of some of these people before.
Yeah.
And I got so into reading reading these ideas and thinking about these ideas and talking about them that it then, yeah, it fulfilled the need that used to be filled through like making things, and then I
Hmm.
like leaned too far into that in a way and had to kind of pull back, kind of like exactly what you're talking about of finishing the PhD and having to make this book. I totally get. I have a like really big question that you can kind of answer however you want to answer it. I'm curious, how do you have thoughts on how that deep reading and then that writing has either influenced the your more visual work, or you could kind of answer this even bigger, and how the PhD and your time at Harvard and writing about other people, and other artwork, how did that then how has that kind of come back and changed how you think about your photography work, or influenced Le Corbuffet, or this, kind of more quote unquote traditional art practice that is what even set you on this journey? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's for me it's a tool for thinking. I think clear writing is clear thinking. And I think doing a PhD taught me how to think, and with
Mm,
some of the best people, honestly. I mean, some of the brightest thinkers. I mean, there were moments where and I'm not trying to like valorize like Ivy League academia, but like it has its problems and it's incredibly elitist. And I'm not saying if you don't have an Ivy League education, you're not intelligent, but I'm saying that I was though exposed to
yeah.
incredible professional thinkers, like people who are like elite thinkers. And I was really lucky, not everyone, but like some, and they just also happen to be incredibly generous intellectual thinkers, like people who would really not just kind of like promote their own project, but really help, be a
Yeah.
community of colleagues that would lend their minds towards a problem that you're working on or that someone else is working on. And I think that to me was such an incredible opportunity. And also, like, I was in an interdisciplinary PhD program where I was like, people in like I was in conversation with had like nothing to do with what I was interested in. And so the
Mm,
questions that they would ask were just fascinating, and the ways in which we can start to relate experiences and ideas, like it was just phenomenal to like I just, like people like to poo-poo on their PhDs and blah 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 and the experience of it, and Ivy League, da 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 da. But I will say that yes, a lot of those criticisms are totally valid. But it was also for me for not having access to those kinds of opportunities otherwise. Like it was just an incredible opportunity, and
Mm-hmm.
so and especially like learning, taking classes in the history of science and like hearing how historians of science think about concepts in the world that in the humanities are approached from very different vantages. And I just think that was it really advanced my understanding of how intricate these relationships are in terms of how we think about
Yeah. Yeah.
categories and themes and ideas, and just even the literature I was exposed to. It was so humbling to me to be exposed to all of that. And
Mm.
just there's so much more
Mm-hmm.
I want to read and so much more I want to learn. And I don't know, it just wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
so on that level, it was like, it opened up for me a totally different way of thinking about ideas around identity or even concepts of nature and the consequences of those kinds of things when it comes to world making. And like, and so, I think as an artist, like I was interested in art and architecture and, questions of space because of the stakes of world making. And in my work as an artist, it was, I could create these kind of what seem more like speculative situations, right? Of like aesthetic experiences or
Mm-hmm.
spatial experiences that cause you to feel certain things. And for me, it was always a question of like, of thinking about that relationship and crafting that experience. And then as a historian or as a writer or even just as an artist writing or however you want to, whatever hat you want to wear, like
Mm-hmm.
it just allows me a different way. It's just a different form of thinking in the way that art is one mode of thinking and words are another mode of thinking. And I struggle with it. Like I'm not, I don't know, I'm suspicious of those people who are like, oh yeah, I can just sit down and like churn out like whatever,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
writing is so easy. It's like I really, it is so hard for me to write, like so hard for me to write, and for a lot of reasons. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that's like the perpetual, it's like the stereotype of the writer, the frustrated writer. But like it is really hard. And so that's also another conversation maybe around craft of writing, which is like I really only, if I'm honest, maybe in the past 5 or 6 years, I really thought about more seriously. But I primarily wasn't thinking about craft. It was really just about a way for me to clarify intention and understand sort of things for myself, like understand and parse out relationships of things that I was interested in for myself. So it was really just a tool.
Can you talk more about the craft of writing? Because this is something I was interested in talking to you about. Because
Yeah.
as a designer who also writes, I only realized in the last couple of years that I, how I could think about writing almost as a form of design also, and thinking about form and structure and rhythm and all the things that I think about when I'm, laying out a page or something. I
Yeah.
could also think of, like, I like you had thought of writing for a long time just as a way to kind of think through something, but not to actually make it to think about the formal qualities of the writing itself or the voice or the tone. And I'm interested in how you kind of move between these. You've written academic papers that are kind of following that format. I think Le Corbuffet has, a more kind of satirical type of writing in it also. You move between these modes also. How do you think about how the form of the writing or the craft of the writing influences the ideas that you're thinking through?
Yeah. I think about it. I don't know if the form, I don't know if it's really that I think about the form influencing the ideas, but I think about how the ideas
Mm-hmm.
need to adapt. Well, I don't know.
How the form, maybe a better way, like how the form is generated by the ideas or something, like how the
Yeah.
ideas
Well,
influence
it's
what the form has to be.
yeah, I think it's the intention. So, form, I mean, I'm looking at it like my shelf of books and I'm looking at all these incredible writers like Janet Malcolm, man. Like,
Mm.
wow, like could I like ever write a sentence like Janet Malcolm or a paragraph like Janet, like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just I'm not at that level. I'm not a professional writer. I'm terrible with deadlines. I'm like I could never be a journalist. I could never be. I have
Okay.
such admiration for people who can write long form essays, just like, just kind of like whip these things off for book forum or like London Review of
Yeah.
Books or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just, the New Yorker, like I'm not that kind of writer. I would say in terms of like formats of writing or audience, I think about
Mm-hmm.
audience and I think about experience and like communication really. So what the objectives are. Like if I'm writing a dissertation, I mean, this is to say, like I actually paid more attention to form in writing and actually cultivating hopefully a tolerable experience writing or an interesting experience with reading when I was writing my dissertation, because I realized that I needed to get through the writing. And I was having a really hard time. Like I was really blocked when I was trying to write my dissertation because I was so mired with like self-doubt. And, I wrote it took a year for me to write one chapter. It was like the worst thing I'd ever written. And my advisor even was just like, what is this? And he's like, you don't write like this. And I was like, I know, I'm just like, I'm like crippled with self-doubt.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can just hear the critics. And so then I needed to develop a way in which I got in a mindset where I was writing to someone that I trusted, like an imaginary person, an audience that I trusted, that wanted that I could have like I felt like it was safe for me to like have a conversation with. That
Yeah.
audience for dissertation is obviously going to be a very different set of people than like the audience for Le Corbuffet. And there's obviously very different objectives. Like Le Corbuffet, I'm not allowed to have footnotes in my, my publisher was just like, no, my, dissertation. It's like, it's all about that kind of level of like precision. And it, that said, I really tried to write a dissertation that read like a story, and for a lot of reasons, methodologically, but like my committee though all said like I felt engrossed in a narrative, and I was like, that was my objective. That like, is there a way that you can use writing as aesthetically, like use it as a form to then deliver and make for a compelling set of arguments? And I think about form of writing in the way that like I think about genre in photography in some ways. Like I still to add to my like my multi-hyphenate whatever list, like I still shoot commercially for editorial
Right.
clients.
Yeah.
Like I just shot, I'm not trying to sound like whatever, but like, I shoot a lot for the New York Times, basically. I shoot still life for the New York Times.
Yeah.
And, shooting still life is very different than shooting fashion. It's very different than making whatever. I like it because it's super technical work, and I just find it really enjoyable and technical work. It's hard to do often, and I also really just like working with them. But it's like there's different genres in the same way that if you're composing a song, there's different genres, right? And different kind of structures and different expectations. If you're making like a fugue versus if you're making a punk song, like it's like very different rhythm, very different vibe, like different MO, and I just think of it on those terms.
Yeah.
And I'm not, and I think in the back of my mind, because when I was thinking, I mean, I've always wanted to be an artist since I was little, but like I played music for a long time and I played in a lot of bands. And so I think about making art the way that I intuitively know how to make music, if that makes sense. Like there's a certain kind of like feeling and a kind of like, there is a kind of narrative in the sense of like a kind of sequence of feelings or emotions or a kind of like something, right? Sonically that you're doing. And with especially with time-based work, like there's a kind of similarity in that. But with writing, like as you were saying, just like when you're designing something, there is a kind of rhythm and a cadence and a, and a feeling to it, and color, like all of these things are elements that are like like writing a song. And so I just think of it in terms of genres. Like, are you doing an orchestral soundtrack like John Williams style for like Lord of the Rings, or are you doing like making a punk song that's 2 minutes long that is like super aggressive and you just need to turn it out and it's for that audience? You know what I mean? It's like, it's just, I don't know if that really answers your question, but like that's sort of how I think about it. And so obviously, like, do I want to put people to sleep? If so, then like I'll write as if I'm like writing a dissertation.
Yeah.
Or like a peer-reviewed journal publication. And
Yeah.
even then, I think I do try to push the limits of like how journal publications are written, because I can't handle, like I kind of can't handle getting through that kind of material sometimes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
why make it painful for people when you can make it a little bit more interesting and enjoyable? And um, this is to say, like, I don't know that I'm good at it. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's really hard, and I'm not a professional writer. And I think there are people who devote a lot of energy to it in ways that I don't. I just
Well,
don't. Like, it's not my primary craft. I don't see writing as my primary craft.
yeah. So can we talk about this in, I mean, you mentioned Le Corbuffet again, and so I think this is actually maybe an interesting almost like case study to kind of what you're talking about.
Okay.
Can you talk about, well, so first of all, for people who don't know what this book is, can you describe what this book is, but then can you also then talk about kind of like how you answered these questions that you were just talking about, like how you thought about the audience, or like what that tone or vibe was that you were going for with that, and how that then helped kind of determine the form of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there was so it's an artist book in the form of a cookbook. It was produced while I was writing a PhD in architectural history and theory,
Hmm.
like writing my dissertation, and it was really like an outlet um for me to, I don't know, I guess, like ask some really fundamental questions around cultural value, really. Like, as
Hmm.
someone that is like producing a narrative, which, albeit it was like very critical of a lot of really canonical players and canonical projects. um, and but I had to really think about sort of like my role as a historian and promoting certain kinds of narratives, and really also thinking about like how those narratives that historians write or curators write or theorists write
Hmm.
also play into the kind of cultural value of objects, which at this point are like just monetized things, right? So
Hmm.
if I'm writing
Hmm.
about the Bauhaus, if I'm writing about whomever, whatever artists like Richard Hamilton or whomever, these are people in my dissertation. In some ways, like I may be like contributing to a certain kind of mythology or canonization. I mean, these are really basic things that historians have to think about, um, I found it like, um, I wanted to find a space in which I could still, uh, I don't know, I could use humor, and I could
Yeah.
like use play and
Yeah.
like think about it still as a kind of with some elasticity, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I started throwing these dinner parties. And the name Le Corbuffet came from a colleague that I was teaching at Cooper with at the time. This was like,
Mm.
I think 2015 or something, Jimmy Lauder. And I was like, I want to make these like food parties with like dishes that are inspired by art and design, just to kind of like, I don't know, just to be, just to have some fun. And he was like, Le Corbuffet. And I was like, I mean, Jimmy Lauder is like legitimately one of the funniest people in the world. So I was like, done, like, I'm going to take it. He's like, take it. So I started throwing these dinner parties, um, and just inviting people I knew, most people I
Mhm.
know are in the art and design kind of creative communities or whatever. They, and and it just became like a funny like text message thread of me asking friends like, I don't know, like, Maholi Naj, what do you think? Macaroni Naj? Like Laszlo Macaroni Naj? Like what would that, like, like just kind of like playing with
Yeah.
puns and
Yeah.
kind of like mixing idioms and but then it sort of developed into like, so it was really just a way for me to kind of like have fun, but also like liberate the narratives a little bit of like how what we're taught, about
Yeah.
certain
Yeah.
works, and provide a space for like a little bit of like a different interpretation. And I started to think a little bit more about like what's the stake, what are the stakes of that question, and what does it mean to have a certain kind of expertise in developing a narrative around a work, or and a like, and how and like determining how it has value in the world or whatever it might be. And so I started doing this, and I started like thinking about, I just always gravitate towards thinking about publications for some reason, and I was just thinking like, if this was a book, what would it be? And I, in my like dissertation mode, I was like, oh yeah, it's going to be this like theoretical manifesto. Da, da, da. And then I got an email from an editor at Prestel, which is like one of the oldest art and design publishers in the
Mhm.
world. Like this, like, it's been around forever. And she was like, hey, I've heard about these like dinner parties that you have been putting on. Have you ever thought about putting together a publication. And I said, yeah, absolutely. And then I met her and she was like, so we're thinking a cookbook. And I was like, what? And I didn't take that seriously as a format until I started really thinking about the history of cookbooks and how they've been used by artists and
Mm-hmm.
designers, and how they were always these kind of polemical formats, because in a lot of ways, like, it's a manual and it's also proposition, and it's looking at ritual and the everyday as a space for a kind of like way of rethinking the politics of everyday life. And so I
Mm-hmm.
thought, like, there may be something to this. And so from there it just kind of started. And it I think the project in some ways is a little bit ambivalent, in the sense that it's not just one note. Like, it
Yeah.
depends on the recipe that you fall on, that there's a way in which, like, I was looking at a lot of Fluxus works and like thinking about participation. And I was like, so what does it mean to think about the cookbook as a kind of post-production manual, right? Like,
Mm.
post-production in the sense that, like, there's some kind of original piece, like the original crepe Suzette. I mean, who knows who ever had, like, no one's experienced that, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
who had
Mm-hmm.
the original kimchi? Like, no one's ever, we don't
Yeah.
know, right? It's
Yeah.
all kind of algorithmic in a weird way. It's all post-production. It's an idea of an original, and there's like an essence of a
Mm.
certain set of things that make that thing. And yet you're always sort of like grappling with how to make that different and your own. And I think in a lot of ways that was sort of my way of thinking about history and like the
Yeah.
canon, right? Like,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
do I like how can I take I don't know, a piece by like Franz Erhard Walther, and then think about, like, well, this is what these experts have said about the work, but like, how can I think about my experience with a work and create my
Mm.
own set of observations around it, or analogies, or metaphors, or whatever it might be, to like generate meaning. And maybe that meaning has some kind of like, maybe doesn't totally align with like its value within academia, or its value within the art market, or its value within museums, and maybe it's a different kind of value. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was sort of like the real basis of the project. And then um, and I also was super interested in like thinking about what it would look like to release a book about art and design and around cultural production in the food world, like, for it to
Mm-hmm.
like operate in that system of economy and meaning making and image making. So it was a kind of a hoax, kind of
Yeah.
a really elaborate social experiment. And what was shocking to me is like, I I mean, I was scared. Like, people told me it would be like the end of my academic career, and I was like, well, I don't even know that I even
Mm.
had one to begin with. So like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know what the
Yeah.
stakes are. Like, who gives a shit? Like, who cares
Yeah.
about me? No one cares about me. No one's thinking about me. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
the center. I'm not the protagonist in other people's lives. Like, I'm sure they'll get over it. And if they don't take me seriously, well, then they're not my people. Like, I don't know.
Right.
Like, that,
Right.
what kind of life is that? But
Right.
I got a lot of flack from academic folks about it, where they didn't know what to do with it. And I was like, well, whatever. Like, I think, I was I had come across an essay by Lisa Lepard about Trojan horses and about art and
Mm-hmm.
activism. And I never thought about Le Corbuffet as an activist work, but it's just, there's something really interesting what happens when you, as a maker, release yourself from the obligations of a professional community. And you're just like, I don't care if this doesn't like look like art or operate in the
Yeah.
way that art should operate. Like, I'm not, there's no blue chip art gallery where that can monetize this book and like make me an
Mm-hmm.
art star or whatever. And I'm just going to release this thing in the world and as an experiment and see what happens. And it was crazy. Like, it kind of hit the cultural water supply in ways
Yeah.
that like I had no idea. Like, I didn't know what to do. Like, I was getting like every day, like I would get emails from like
It was everywhere.
Vanity
Yeah.
Fair, Vogue, like New Yorker, like everyone, New York magazines, like top 10 books on what to get your dad. Like, it didn't make any sense to me. And I was like, has anyone opened this book and like read
Right.
it? And they hadn't. Like, I was convinced that they hadn't.
Mm.
Because I think if you actually read the text, some of the recipes are a little bit like they're kind of poking fun. Like, I mean, Lawrence Weiner's wieners
Yeah,
are
right.
really just like boiled wieners, and it's like the recipe is basically a riff on like his instruction set. But other works are trying to interrogate questions of immigration or migration, or you know what I mean, like all of these kinds of things around cultural heritage. I mean, this was like during the time where it was like everyone was being banned by Trump, like, you know, it was like an
Right,
incredibly,
right.
it still is very inhospitable, but like, you know, and so I was just, you know, for me it was like there are critical elements woven throughout, but it doesn't always take one voice. And for
Yeah,
it to then like hit this kind of cultural water supply where it's like in vogue, I just didn't know what to do with that. um
yeah.
but it was an interesting learning experience in a way in which like thinking about, and again, like I haven't written this out, and I might actually write this out, like write this into a thing, but produce an essay around this. But in things, but in terms of like thinking about how production value has somehow eclipsed like the semiotics of like what is actually imaged. So there's
Mm,
like images
mm-hmm.
of like literal garbage, like it's like or packaging, and you know, like I had no money to produce this book, and I had no time, and I was shooting for like 12 hours a day, while I was supposed to also be working my dissertation. And I would like go around my neighborhood looking for things to use as props, and I just couldn't
Mm-hmm.
afford to buy all the stuff. I didn't get a grant to produce it, like it was,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And but it didn't, it somehow was really weird that like luxury aspirational publications would be touting this book, and when you open it up, the way it's also photographs food and foodstuffs
Yeah,
is like very
yeah.
much a critique of the industry of image making around food, and also around the aspirational culture around food and how it's become totally classist. And I mean, it always has
Mm-hmm.
been, but it was weird that they couldn't see that, like
Right.
and I realized it's production value. It's because I photographed it in a kind of like high-end editorial style, and not because. And so anyways, sorry, I'm totally digressing, but that it provided a lot of really interesting lessons for me about like the status of the image economy today,
Yeah.
which has like really informed, I think, how I think about image making now, like whether it's for a commercial, you know,
Right.
assignment, or if it's for my own artwork.
It's an interesting case study in kind of what we were just talking about how sort of the ideas helped generate the form that it took, and you know, you had these questions that then were able to manifest themselves through photography, through the form of the cookbook, through, you know, all of these kind of questions. But then on the flip side, the form can also almost get in the way. And I mean, this is kind of a design question that I think about all the time, where if you make something look like quote unquote good graphic design, it's taken seriously, like regardless of the, like, you know, the form of something can then suggest an idea that might not really be there, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
or mask what it's actually trying to say. You put something in like, you know, a clean typeface with like a nice logo, and you're like, oh, that's a real company. You know what I mean?
Well, you know, I think people, when I've been asked to talk about Le Corbuffet, um, I don't know if people feel disappointed, but I feel maybe they are. Maybe they're totally disappointed by the project. But I I realized that people expected this book to be produced as if the way that one writes a thesis, the way that one is like, I'm putting out an argument and here it is
Mm-hmm.
totally resolved. And I don't see I don't see art, I don't see books, I don't see cultural products like that. Like I
Right.
think that I started out with a set of interests and questions. It I created this thing as a way to think through those questions. It the thing I've made is like anything that anyone makes is a kind of Frankenstein creation that also then has other like an afterlife, like, or many lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it does its own thing in ways that you couldn't anticipate. And I think this is where, just going back to like the reliance on theory to kind of mask fear, I think that is the fear that I've always, like Le Corbuffet, like ripped open like ripped off the band-aid of that fear of being totally
Right.
exposed by like producing a project that, if I'm honest, like I hope my publisher's not listening, but like I literally thought no one was going to read this. Like I thought it was just like so weird that this
Yeah.
book, and it's not even as if like I've sold that many, but it just,
Yeah.
the exposure of the book was so freaky to me. And I was scared. I was scared by it because of the way it opens you up to
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
criticism. And
Yeah.
also I didn't know what the book would do. Like, it's like you create this thing, it's in the world, and then it kind of just does its thing in the world, and it's not really about you. It's kind of
Yeah.
its own thing. And
Right.
anyway, so this to say, I think like, form is super interesting in that way. And it was a total collaboration. I worked with like Alex and Jenna at Studio Lynn, and
Mm-hmm.
they brought such incredible ideas to the table. And, they were looking at like, I hand them all these references of like 60s process art, and, thinking about
Mm.
materials and Fluxus and action scripts and Marcel Bruteur's like typography, like all these things that I love that I was thinking about, and all my references. And they were able to find these like threads in that, those very specific set of like historical references too, that they wanted to, you know, bring into the contemporary moment. And I mean, their original idea for the book was hilarious. I think it would have been probably like 400 pages and weighed like 700 pounds. They wanted to blow up all of the ingredients. So they were this massive, massive, you know, huge.
Mm.
So that it really emphasizes materiality. So you're not reading it thinking like 4 carats. You're like 4 carats. Like, it's like,
Right.
it's like screaming at you. And they were really into like the monospace type as a way of thinking about like
Mm-hmm.
typewriters as the dominant technology at the time, and all these things that I thought were so
Mm-hmm.
smart. And so yeah, I just like they brought a whole other level to it. And I just love the experience of working with them, because they really helped to just really make it a thing in the world. And so yeah, so it's a total collaboration in that sense. But like, I don't think, but in that sense, it's like alchemical. It's like you don't
Mm.
know.
Yeah.
It's not a formula. It's like I mean, cookbooks are a formula. There's like an industry around it. I learned very quickly. There are sets of expectations around that, and so the challenge that I had was like, how do I hack that formula?
Right.
Like, hack
Right.
it, and what happens if it gets distributed into that circulation system of cookbook publishing, which at this point is like, it's a very lucrative market.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
um and can I and what will happen if like a different audience that picks up the book. And so anyways, but it's led to like incredible conversations even with like people in the food world who are like, what, I opened this book, I thought it was a novelty book, I started realizing that the kind of class critique that
Mm.
you have within this is totally applies to the food world in terms of its elitism.
Right.
And I was like, yep. There's a reason why like the recipes try to avoid fancy ingredients and
Yeah.
implements and all these things. It's like how do we make it super DIY so that everyone can be an artist, everyone can be a producer, everyone can be an interpreter of cultural works, everyone can be a historian, everyone, and that's the goal. And like, maybe I failed, but it just led to like such interesting um experiences and like questions that but it is like, but it's really hard to relinquish control and allow yourself that experience of learning alongside everyone else when you're responsible for it. And also you have to answer all these questions, and it's like, well, why didn't you do this and why didn't you do that? And it's like, I don't
Yeah.
know, I was in the moment, and I was also negotiating with a publisher who had like, their commercial publisher, and they had very strong opinions about making not losing money and wanting it to be a commercially viable success. So it's like, I think, I don't know, I always just think about like um I don't know, this probably sounds so tangential like everything else I've said, but like Marcel Duchamp was like a cheesemonger at one point in his career.
Hmm.
Like he literally
I don't
sold.
think I knew that.
Yep, he sold cheese. I mean, it for a lot of reasons. Like he said, he didn't admit that he was an artist. But I think about I think about that all the time. And how you know one of the artists as a kind of profession is in like the kind of neoliberal sense is like there's a certain kind of blue chip artist that makes a certain kind of
Mm-hmm.
work.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not trying to poo-poo that. Like, I think it's great if you can operate at that level of production or whatever. But I also think there's a tradition of artists where you are a chameleon, where you say you're a museum creator, like Marcel Brutairs, and you start your own museum, or you are
Mm-hmm.
a poet,
Mm-hmm.
or you are a whatever. You are what you need to be in order to make a certain set of circumstances or a kind of experiment or to hack culture or whatever you do. Like, and I love that freedom that
Yeah. Yeah.
those models of being in the world like can offer. And so this is to say, like, and hey, like, only in retrospect are we like, oh yeah, it makes total sense that like artists would start a restaurant in Soho. At the time, it like probably didn't make sense to a lot of like art dealers or collectors, right? And then it needs to be commodified as like, oh, relational aesthetics or whatever we call things in order for
Yeah.
it to like accrue value within a system of, a commercial art world or whatever it might be. And so this is to say, like, the freedom that can offer you, I love, but it does come at a price in a way because it's not easily understood, and it's also hard when you're in the contours of the moment to totally understand what something that you've made in the world is doing.
I mean, it's nice in that it almost like brings this conversation back full circle, talking about the commas in what you do. I want to use that to very briefly talk about two other books that you co-edited: "Architecture at the Edge of Everything Else" and "Architecture is All Over," which are
Hmm.
two books that I loved for many reasons. But I think both of those books are about the sort of blurry definitions of architecture, or how architects kind of move into other spaces, or and like whether that's still architecture or not. And I read "Architecture is All Over." You write in the intro to that could be all over as in finished, which is how I read it until I
Hmm.
read the intro, which probably says something about my feelings about architecture and design. But it's also all over as in everywhere. And that's kind of been the theme of this conversation, actually, is this kind of you moving between these different spaces and being interested in people who are kind of moving across these different spaces. And I'm kind of curious, I guess, that interest in these, your kind of critical interest in these moving between disciplines, is that a way for you to situate yourself? Or like do you see your work as part of that lineage? I mean, you just mentioned like opening the restaurant in Soho, and you've written a lot about people like, Gordon Matta Clark and Assemble, and these kind of architecture people who move across conceptual spaces. How do you see your work as kind of part of that type of tradition, or do you at all?
I guess I've never really thought about my work as part of a tradition. I would say,
Tradition might not be the right word, but it seems like the people, especially like kind of the themes of those two books, and even the people that we've talked about today, are people who are kind of moving across spaces, much like you are.
yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think I'm interested in ideas. Like,
Hmm.
the reason, like, even in my, I don't know, it's really weird. I came across an essay I wrote, I don't know how long ago. I think it was in like 2005, like when I was in grad school or something. And but doing my MFA, it was about relational aesthetics, and it was
Mm,
about how artists are using design and architecture as backdrops for a certain kind of theater of social production.
mm.
And it was really critical, like super critical of that move. Um, for whatever reason, I keep thinking about that essay, not because I had like particularly good insights, but just in the sense that it like, I think crystallized for me um, why I find architecture and art or architecture and design so interesting, which is that it's a kind of like aesthetic form that you can touch, and it's a kind
Yeah.
of, it has ritual and habit and habitus, like all of those ideas like built within it, within these things. Like, most people will know how to interact with a chair. There's a kind of
Mm,
cheeriness to the
mhm,
chair. You know what I mean?
mhm,
Like,
mhm,
there's a
mhm.
kind of like social production that's kind of inscribed within certain objects of use that I find super interesting. That is a space for playing with. Yeah, I think like I'm interested in like how they form ideas about self and the world,
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
right? Like, if they're world making technologies. And I think I've always just been super interested in that. So, and I think to that end, like, I mean, there's a million painters and sculptors and photographers that I like who make kind of discrete art objects for a kind of aesthetic appreciation. But I find myself, I think, increasingly, as much as I still like making those kinds of, I like making images and I like making videos and I like making, those kinds of experiences. Like, I would say I've always been interested in a kind of participatory element or like a dialogical element to image making, which only really, I think, has become clear to me in the past 5 years or so, that's which doesn't make any sense, because actually I was doing this even my undergrad. Like, my undergraduate thesis was actually anyways, yeah, I don't know. It's maybe I should spend more time like trying to like write about my own work and trying to clarify the aims to have it be more focused. But yeah. image making, and I've been reading right now a lot about the relationship between sculpture and dialogical aesthetics or participatory aesthetics, and like how certain artists have used objects as ways of mediational tools to kind of create social production or social situations. And I'm super interested in how images in their varying ways, like screen culture, Zoom culture, all of these different kinds of technologies of image making in the image economy can also facilitate a certain kind of architecture of the social, if we call it that.
Right.
So, but I don't know that I've found a lot of like really interesting thinking and writing about that specifically. I think a lot of it has really happened within the world of performance and sculpture, at least in the art world. But anyway, so this is to say, like, I don't know. I just think of myself as like operating within like a constellation of ideas. And so certain practices that interest me usually tend to, like touch on those ideas in some ways. So
I think it's a good way to ask you the last question, which is the question I used to end all of these, which is, I'm just curious what you're reading right now.
I mean, I'm reading a lot of things because I'm writing syllabi.
Oh, right.
I'm reading actually, so a couple things. There's a book of conversations between Tanya Bruguera and Claire Bishop that look at Tanya Bruguera's ideas around sort of like her social engaged practices and the way she thinks about participatory aesthetics and activism, which is phenomenal. It's just called Tanya Bruguera in Conversation with Claire Bishop. Also, I picked up, or it just arrived in the mail, a book on Franz Erhard Welther called Objects to Use, Instruments for Processes. Like, his work is something that's really been interesting to me. And I'm, I've just been thinking a lot about like ways in which some ideas from around social architecture from Joseph Beuys have sort of been, can be translated in other people's work and vice versa. Because I think also that concept is a little under theorized. So anyways, those are the things that I'm reading amongst a plethora of like,
of course,
course stuff for courses that I'm teaching. But yeah, I think those two books have been things that I've been thinking a lot about.
Esther, this was so fun. I really like your work, and I really like how you think about your work. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. And sorry for rambling so much.
Oh no, I love those conversations. This episode was recorded on August 25th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.